The Funhouse is a 1981 film directed by Tobe Hooper and stars Elizabeth Berridge, Kevin Conway, Cooper Huckabee, Largo Woodruff, and Miles Chapin. The plot follows a group of teens finding themselves in some trouble after witnessing a murder at a grimy local carnival. I have respect for all of the early cult American horror directors, George A. Romero, John Carpenter, Wes Craven, Tobe Hooper, just to name a few. Some are among my favorite directors of all time, like John Carpenter. Tobe Hooper, though, is a director that I like, but his output overall has kind of always statistically been far from my favorite over the years. Just something that I've noticed. I mean, those first two Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies, those are probably the only things that he's done that I outright love. But the Funhouse is, probably my next favorite. I think Eaten Alive is cool too. I'm not real huge on it though. I actually do love his Salem's Lot miniseries. I should throw that into the stuff that I love because I absolutely do love that thing. And Poltergeist as well, but well, I guess we all know the story behind that one. It's kind of sketchy. I think that what I appreciate most about this film, though, is that it's got that, gritty, grimy, sleazy style of his earlier work. So for me, this can slide right next to, Chainsaw and Eaten Alive. This thing is sleazy, right from the beginning, by the way. You get some fun cinematography and a homage to Halloween, which you probably noticed, or you will notice if you look for it now. As Joey, the troublemaker little brother of our final girl, Amy, tries to scare her by walking into the shower and stabs her with a fake knife. Homage to Psycho, of course. It's a funny scene that probably doesn't hold up super well. I guess it's funny, also kind of weird, but at least they're trying. I guess trying to have some fun and setting up these cool with these cool horror homages. You just know right what you're getting. It works pretty well, actually. So after that, Amy gets picked up by her new boyfriend, Buzz, so they can go to the carnival. She had to lie to her parents because apparently some bad shit had happened or had been happening at this carnival over recent weeks or whatever, and they didn't want her going. And her parents don't really like Buzz. So they kind of judge him because, he looks like he's maybe a little bit older than Amy, and he doesn't really, have his life quite figured out yet. Fuck him, right? Jesus Christ. Buzz, he's a pretty solid dude, though. Give a guy a chance. So they meet up with some other friends, a couple named Liz and Richie. I especially like Richie because he's always, smoking joints and cracking funny jokes, and he feels like a classic old school, horror character. I really liked him. The writing overall, though, is pretty solid across the board. The characters are memorable enough. Maybe as a whole, they're not super great, but they have a fairly real feel to them, and I do give this script credit for that. The world building is cool too. A grimy carnival is always going to work, if you do it right. But in 1981, I think it worked especially well. I do think world building could have been furthered though by using more of the carnival, but it's still pretty effective. And adding to that, grimy atmosphere is the group of degenerates, of course, that run the park. Because they've always stood out to me as pretty memorable. You have the carnival barker played by Kevin Conrad and his deformed son / assistant Gunther, and a fortune teller named Xena. I mean, I think they could sit fairly comfortably next to the other Tobe Hooper characters like the family from Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Judd from Eaten Alive. I'll try not to talk too much about Texas Chainsaw Massacre though throughout this whole review. But the Funhouse does remind me a lot of that movie, in the best of ways, and that is despite Tobe Hooper not doing any of the writing. He's never really been a primary writer in his films, but, he loved this script and fits his style pretty much perfectly. I guess I can see why he would be interested in directing this. I mean, it's got those family themes and, distrust of outsiders. And it's almost surprising, how none of his previous partners were involved, in this script. Maybe it was literally written just for him completely intentionally. I'm not really sure. Kevin Conroy's character, who doesn't really have even a name, by the way, which is I just call him the Carnival Barker. But he is basically, Jim Seidow from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And our nonverbal Gunther, also credited as the monster, is basically, this film's Leatherface. He's developmentally disabled, wears a mask, and is mistreated by, pretty much everyone. Gunther's look was created actually by Rick Baker and Craig Reardon, and Baker described him as pretty much, a birth defect, type monster. He also said that he felt bad about designing a monster, based on actual human, deformities. So purposely made it look, slightly less realistic than I guess it was going to turn out to be. I don't know though. I like his look okay, but I'm not a massive fan of it. I suppose it does fit the Funhouse carnival vibe, but I also feel like it looks too much like a rubber mask with a wig. Where I think just pure prosthetics would have worked better. Just my stupid opinion. So I'm giving the Funhouse a 5.5 out of 10. I feel kind of weird for giving it a lower score because I do like this film. The pacing is mostly super solid, and the cat and mouse kind of slasher scenes are fun, but some of them do drag on maybe for just a little bit too long, just a bit. And maybe the lack of a great final girl holds it back to an extent also. But it's a great spooky season watch, especially because of the the Funhouse haunted house ride. I think it sits right next to not only Tobe Hooper's early stuff, but maybe even also films like Tourist Trap and maybe even The Hills Have Eyes. Cheers, guys, and I'll see you at the multiplex. Subscribe right now, please.